Thank you, everybody, for the warm welcome. Over the next half hour, we are going to deep dive into questions related to how to move from principles to practice in governing AI. That is the official title. The unofficial title could have been called AI Governance Speed Dating, where over the next 30 minutes or so, we will hear different perspectives from different stakeholders and regions of the world in terms of their approaches of what they are seeing working, what they are seeing not working, what they think needs to be scaled, and if you feel like swiping right on all of the above, you can. So I want to make sure that we allocate as much time as possible to the meat of these conversations and lessons learned that all of you are going to share. And I want to kick it off in terms of framing the conversation with you, Brian. Can you share what you're seeing in terms of key frontier AI risks and what we should be paying attention to right now?
First of all, it's a great honor to be on this panel today. To ensure that AI could be used as a force for good, we have to start by identifying and managing some of the global scale challenges that we face as humanity. Drawing from the International AI Safety Report and some of the latest research, I think there are at least 4 types of frontier AI risk. Number 1 is misuse. As frontier AI systems achieve human expert level performance on areas like scientific reasoning, coding, and even virology, there's also the potential for lowering the barrier for malicious actors to launch cyber attacks or even design dangerous pathogens. For example, recent studies have shown that teams of AI agents are able to exploit zero-day vulnerabilities in real-world settings in open source softwares. So one measure could be providing early and differential access for developing countermeasures to make sure that we have defensive capabilities on the upper hand over the attackers. Number 2 is accidents and malfunctions. While hallucinations from chatbots could be quite amusing, it could be dangerous in use cases like medical diagnosis. So recently, the Beijing government has implemented regulations prohibiting AI from writing medical prescriptions automatically. So classifying some applications as high risk and making sure that we have robust public safety regulations is critical. Number 3 is potential loss of control scenarios. As Professor Geoffrey Hinton has mentioned in the summit, we don't currently have robust mechanisms to ensure that digital superintelligence could be remained under human control. In fact, there is a growing body of evidence showing that frontier AI systems have the tendency to deceive humans or even try to evade human oversight under particular conditions. Now, of course, frontier AI systems still struggle to bypass know your customer checks and will struggle to autonomously replicate in the wild. But I think for catastrophic risk, even if they are low probability or of unknown probability, we should take precautionary measures. The 4th one is systemic risk at the societal level. One particular example is that as general purpose AI outperform humans on many of the economically valuable tasks, the impact on the labor market would be profound. And these gradual and diffuse impacts cannot be managed by any single organization, right? So we need a multi-stakeholder approach, both at the national and the global level, to ensure that no one would be left behind. And I think that's what makes the ITU platform so valuable. Thank you.
Brian, thanks so much for that introductory overview, and I think your emphasis on the need for multi-stakeholder collaboration and dialogue and alignment is one of the reasons why this summit is so important, but also why it's absolutely crucial to get these different groups in the room to agree on what does risk look like, what are we talking about, and what kind of governance is most effective. It's a challenge, and all of you know this firsthand in the work that you're doing, to think through governance models that address risks in a technology field where, in reality, advancements are moving super quickly. And Chris, you've done a lot of work at the Frontier Model Forum, trying to think through very concretely what kind of governance models or approaches, whether that's regulatory, institutional, or voluntary, can actually address the fast pace of the development of this technology. What do you believe is showing the most promise in terms of these different approaches that you're seeing, particularly as it concerns possible global alignment?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here and just a wonderful chance to speak to such a great multi-stakeholder audience for a really important conversation that hopefully we can make a lot of progress together with. As far as kind of which approaches might have most promise, one thing that I would really flag would be the Frontier AI frameworks and the kind of voluntary commitments that a set of companies made in Seoul at the Seoul AI Summit in May of last year, where they committed to, again, there were about 15 or 16 companies, I believe, globally that signed these commitments. And the commitment was to identify what they considered intolerable risks and their plan for managing those risks. And over the last year and a half, most of the companies that made that commitment have spent a lot of time trying to flesh out what are now called frontier AI frameworks, or what others might call a safety and security framework. And the goal of this is to try and make sure that we have a risk management framework that is fit for purpose for the specific kinds of risks that were just alluded to. Brian, I think, did a great job of outlining the full array of risks that might come with frontier AI. Some of those risks, I think, can be managed by adapting existing risk management instruments. But there's other risks that we might actually need an entirely new type of risk management instrument for. And in particular, there's a class of risk that if it appears, it may appear very quickly and at extreme scale very quickly in a way that the harms don't materialize until it's too late to do anything about them. In which case, you need a risk management instrument that's able to identify those issues in advance, or as far in advance as possible. And that's what frontier AI frameworks are really designed to do. And I think there's been a tremendous amount of progress over the last year in identifying which risks fall into that category. I think there's growing consensus that bio risks, advanced cyber risks, autonomous R&D capabilities, those kinds of capabilities really require, I think, a fundamentally new type of risk management instrument that we're starting to see a lot of. I would say right now we're in the kind of emerging experimentation phase of what those should look like, but hopefully over time we'll increasingly institutionalize them going forward.
Chris, I love how you underlined that a lot of the risks that we're going to have to pay attention to are probably going to emerge really quickly. And the question of, okay, how do we see what already exists that can be adapted? And then where do we see the need to completely invent a new approach and framework to risk? And I want to turn, Ya-Qin, to you, because I'm curious, in this kind of approach of seeing where the risks are, what might emerge, what exists already, and what we might need to develop, what do you see as the practical challenges when implementing AI governance approaches, especially as models become more and more powerful, and how can we actually overcome some of these challenges?
For me? All right. Nice to be here. There are a lot of impediments in implementation. I will just list the three. First is just the rapid technological development events versus the governance regulatory lag. And if you look just in the last 6 months or a year, there'll be tremendous advancement, particularly the agentic AI, and also moving AI from informational domain to physical, cars and robotics. So the risk has been magnified. But obviously, the governance, the regulation have not caught up with it. The second, issue is really the companies, the companies in China, in the U.S., the rest of the world, are really busy with innovation, right? and in a kind of locked, tight arms race. And especially there's no clear accountability, no clear regulation, the tools. So sometimes they might not put the safety as the highest priority. Number three is really the geopolitical issues. Different countries, regions have a different attitude and different approaches to AI safety. UK, EU have different guidelines. China has different guidelines. And US has very different guidelines as well. I would say China is quite open and very inclusive in terms of how to approach the thing with company, work very close with industries, defining how you collect data, how do you do testing, how do you register, and how do you release the big models. How do we overcome them? Probably time is not enough, but let me just mention one thing. We need to continue to invest in R&D in terms of how we identify those critical risks, catastrophic risks, to come up with the red lines, the benchmarks, and the thresholds, and the warning system. Let me also I will talk later if I have time, the 5-stage process, testing, auditing, verification, monitoring, and also the mitigation. But overall, I think the most important thing is for all of us to come together for enhanced global collaboration in form like this.
Ya-Qin, I love your emphasis on needing to invest in R&D and also the need to have regulatory clarity in light of the pace of the technological advancement, but also the context that you provide in terms of different countries going ahead and developing different approaches to questions around risk and also to AI governance. And I want to turn to Juha, to you now, at the forefront of a lot of these conversations in the EU as the EU implements the EU AI Act and the secondary legislation and guidelines related to its implementation. What are you seeing as practical challenges when implementing AI governance? Again, especially as these models are becoming more and more powerful. There were conversations during the EU AI Act about thresholds, systemic risk, guidelines that are currently underway with the Code of Practice for general purpose AI. What do you see as the challenges and also the opportunities to overcome them?
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's indeed a great pleasure to be here and to be a member of this panel. So first of all, the term governance is used in different ways. So we have different kinds of international initiatives, principles, codes of conduct, recommendations, etc. on the one hand. Then on the other hand, we have indeed either soft guardrails or hard law within jurisdictions. So those have of course, slightly different consequences, different implications in terms of compliance and monitoring compliance and enforcement, and the possibility to do that. So this is actually one challenge in and of itself, which is not necessarily even dependent on, though it is complicated by the progress of this technology. It is, of course, a well-known fact, as you said, that the European Union has decided to regulate AI. For us, it's key to ensure trust, and we felt that for ensuring trust, legislation was necessary, because trust is really the sine qua non for the take-up of this technology, which is a sine qua non for the benefits of AI to materialize. And we do believe that there are really very many benefits in this technology. So in the AI Act, we have introduced a mechanism of enabling updates in a way which can keep up with its technology. So we have the high-risk areas defined in an annex, and that can be updated much more quickly and much more easily than having a full revision of legislation. On the other hand, you mentioned the Code of Practice. This is a process which is producing an instrument, a tool to help facilitate compliance with the provisions on general purpose AI models. And this process, it's about to be published, this Code of Practice. It has been conducted, led by independent chairs and co-chairs, with strong multi-stakeholder support. We've had more than 1,000 stakeholders involved in this, and indeed this highlights one of the aspects that was mentioned by Brian at the very beginning. This multi-stakeholder aspect is very important in these processes. But the Code of Practice is aimed at taking into account best practice, current industry practice to the extent that it is feasible, and also to make it as future-proof as possible. But there is also some flexibility in implementing it. So those who sign up to this Code of Practice, they can, in some cases, choose the way, for example, how to put in place mitigation measures for this, to comply with this Code of Practice. And this then obviously would be a presumption of compliance with the relevant provisions. It also refers to the state of art in a number of places, so that kind of can be interpreted flexibly to take into account where we are. And of course, it is possible also for us to review it and revise it as necessary and clarify concepts if it's required. Thank you.
Thank you, Juha. I again appreciate your emphasis on the question of trust, because one of the things that we're seeing in conversations with organizations across the world as a blocker to AI adoption is actually the question of trust. And how do we build trust both in the technology by having an approach of responsibility by design, but also between stakeholders that need to come together and work together to design these kinds of governance approaches. And I want to turn to you, Udbhav, on that specific issue, because I'd be curious to hear from you. It Signal. What are you seeing in terms of the practical challenges in implementing governance, but also building trust? Signal has really been at the forefront of making sure that trust is the center of the ways in which you operate as an industry counterpart. How are you implementing AI governance inside of Signal, and what do you see as both the challenges, again, but also opportunities to build that trust that's necessary?
Thank you. Maybe I'll start with an example, right? And the purpose of the example is to illustrate how Signal as a player in the market is being both impacted and affected by AI, but is in turn also shaping how AI is deployed in practice, and maybe use that to talk about governance and what's working and what's not. So quite recently, Signal rolled out a feature on its desktop installations where if you run Windows 11 and you try to take a screenshot on Windows 11 of the Signal application, all you will get is a blank screen. And the reason we deployed that feature was because Microsoft had deployed Recall, a feature that takes periodic screenshots of your screen, stores them, runs an on-device model that analyzes those screenshots and answers questions that you might have about, say, when did I visit this website, or when did I go to this particular page, or when did I last look up this person's profile. The reason we had to do that was because people use Signal because of the fact that they trust it with their most private information. And not everyone who uses Signal would necessarily understand the fact that the recall feature would be taking screenshots of their screen every 3 seconds and storing them in perpetuity to be able to answer questions that they might have. Now, if you look at Signal as a player in this market, AI regulation has existed in some form or the other for quite some time. Voluntary efforts have existed for quite some time. But yet Microsoft could deploy a system that would take a screenshot of your screen every 3 seconds and deploy it to billions of devices around the world. And there was none of these efforts did anything to actually prevent that from happening. And that's why we had to take action in our own hands, because we had to protect the privacy of our users against the kinds of technologies and contexts in which they are deployed, which are quite different from the contexts of many other AI systems, because a lot of the people who use Signal are particularly high-risk individuals. Which is why, connecting that to governance, I actually think that the solution to a lot of this governance conversation is all of these things need to happen in parallel. I don't think Signal is under any belief that a law will suddenly come into place by early next year that will prevent things like recall from being deployed without users understanding what it really means. I don't think it means that only voluntary efforts are enough, because I think we've seen a lot of precedents from social media and a lot of other places in the industry that self-regulatory efforts have not really worked in practice. And I think ultimately acknowledging that as much as we talk about advanced AI, it is just as important to recognize the very real harms that are occurring to real people with very real consequences that are taking place today because of these AI systems. And unless we choose to address them rather than wondering whether AI will control Skynet 3 years from today, I think we're going to end up in a scenario where some very real harms will occur, and the trust that the society has on these technologies, which is already falling quite a bit because it's not exactly a very popular technology, if you talk to an artist and talk to a lot of other individuals, will keep decreasing. So if we want to earn society's trust, I think we all need to both work together, but also ensure we prevent today's harms from occurring rather than focusing too much on what might be possible tomorrow.
I love that call to action, Udbhav. Yeah. I love that call to action. It's clear that many of you in the room also love that call to action in terms of making sure that we're thinking through and starting with and working backwards from the impact that this has on individuals and users and communities. But I also think your emphasis on privacy by design and working in parallel are equally important. How do we embed in the approach from the beginning and the ways in which we develop this technology in parallel to efforts of governance and regulation and voluntary commitments, privacy and responsibility by design, in order to build that trust to encourage responsible adoption. We've heard a lot of different kinds of models and lessons learned from the 5 of you, and I want to shift a little bit to think through concretely, if there was one element of governance that you would suggest be widely adopted or better coordinated across jurisdictions and stakeholder groups, what would it be and why? Some of you talked about R&D, voluntary commitments like in Seoul, legislative initiatives like the EU AI Act, internal governance approaches like what's happening at Signal. What is the model of AI governance that you would want to push forward and make sure that there's more cooperation on a global level on that we can develop, as you said, Udbhav, very elegantly, in parallel at the same time as the development of this technology? And Brian, I want to start off with you.
Thank you. Given the profound impact from frontier AI systems in the coming years, it's quite striking that we have more regulations on the food safety of dumplings than AI today. And so I think we need more binding regulations, especially for the most powerful AI systems. Just to share two regulatory measures from my region. So the first is pre-deployment registration and licensing. Currently in China, all generative AI would have to be registered with the government before they are deployed to the public, going through a set of safety and security assessments. And this type of registration and licensing could adapt to different regional needs, as well as to adapt to emerging challenges as our understanding of the threat landscape deepens. The second would be post-deployment transparency. For example, having content provenance and watermarking on AI-generated content to make sure that users and society are able to differentiate the realities between those generated by AI versus humans. I think that's critical. And that's something that China has also implemented through a national standard requiring both developers as well as platforms to have explicit labeling as well as implicit metadata. Thank you.
Chris, let's turn to you. What would be your recommendation in terms of something that's working to scale and how?
I think I would build on the comments I was making earlier in the sense that I think one of the things that hopefully will happen over the next 12 months is an increasing push to start standardizing frontier AI frameworks or risk management systems. There's a lot of voluntary activity around them. That means there's a lot of different types of frameworks that have been published. But I think coordinating globally around what a robust frontier AI risk management instrument should look like will be incredibly important. And in doing that, though, I think we need to identify how we're going to create formal standards on a very quick timeline. Because I think the things like SC 42001 at ISO, which is a great AI risk management standard, I think it took 4 or 5 years to develop. And I think we need to really be able to provide something with that kind of rigor, but in a much shorter timeline.
I love that emphasis on the question of standards in terms of their importance in providing clarity, particularly as we think through and hear from organizations that want to scale, but in a safe way. Udbhav, over to you.
I would say that two main things. The first is there is, I think, a recognition that the rate at which some of these technological items are being deployed is far faster than the rate at which they've really been understood, even sometimes by the organizations that develop and deploy them. And without that understanding, I think it's very, very hard for us to come to the conclusion that if we follow process X or standard Y, all of these risks in these systems will be addressed, because in many ways, it's those risks themselves that are not very clearly understood. And the reasons they aren't really understood is because of the fact that they often happen in incredibly proprietary and closed settings with very little interaction with the outside world. And the second is that even when it does happen, the consequence is so much, like every time there's a big model release, like everybody, that's all everyone talks about for that day, like on the internet, like this new model has come out, that people tend to be a lot more risk averse on talking about the limitations and challenges of the kind of models that have been developed and things that they should not be used for. So if you just look at the model cards for all the prominent model providers over the last 3 to 4 years and just analyze the amount of information that used to be present in them and the amount of information that is present in them today for when they come out, we've actually seen a regression. And the reason we are seeing that regression is because there is a greater consequence to that information because of all the hype that has really built up around the industry. So I really think that we need to make sure that there's space and opportunity for people to be able to be clear about faults and drawbacks just as much as there is approaches to what the benefits and progress that this technology is making, because unless we have an honest conversation about that, both from a deployment but also from a addressing problems perspective, I think independent of whether it's a self-regulatory body or an actual legislation, we will not be able to have an honest conversation, and that's what's really important.
I love that emphasis on the need to have honest conversations. I think in parallel to the question around honest conversations, you also implicitly underlined the need to be asking the right questions. What kind of questions do we need to be asking? And a lot of times, very hard questions with regards to both misuse, but also misuse and beneficial use of this technology. Ya-Qin, over to you.
I thought the National AI Safety Institute and lots of the NGOs have played a very constructive and a positive role in the last couple of years. the assess model, they work with industries to monitor and publish the results. So that was great. Let me also mention one thing. And I'm glad to see top academics and the thought leaders like Yashua Benjo and a lot of the AI pioneers are working with industry leaders and the policymakers. And to make this work, and we have to do this in the very beginning, right? By design, and the safety is a foundation of the product. It's not an afterthought.
I love that safety is the foundation and not an afterthought. It's, again, one of the reflections that comes up more and more in conversations is how do we move from an approach of responsibility and safety that from bolted on to built in to by design? How do we ensure approaches that are by design safe and trustworthy? And I think, Juha, you've spent a lot of time thinking about that as well in the work that you're doing on the EU AI Act. What's the kind of key lesson that you've taken away in terms of conversations on AI governance in the EU?
Well, I think there are a number of lessons that could be drawn from that and could be related. But I think, these are complex issues, and they don't actually, complex issues rarely lend themselves to simple solutions, as much as we'd like to have simple solutions. But I think overall, one thing that maybe is worth highlighting is the need for follow-up and update mechanisms. Update we have already talked about, but follow-up as well, because for trust, which has been identified here as one of the key issues, it is actually important to know how and if and how and to what extent whatever measures and recommendations are there were put into practice and how effective they are. So I think that this is one aspect that is important, of course, in the context of legislation that requires this kind of a mechanism that is kind of inbuilt, but it would be required also then for other sort of softer approaches.
I want to build on your last statement, Juha, and shift to a kind of closing call to action and reflections in the couple minutes that we have left, and ask all of you, looking ahead over the next 12 months, and 12 months in the time of AI is probably in dog years, 12 years, what's one concrete step, is it a norm, a protocol, collaboration that's needed, a standard, you'd like to see move forward to make AI governance more effective in practice? A lot of you have talked about the need for international collaboration and alignment, the need for gaps analysis, the need for multi-stakeholder conversations. What's one thing that you would like to see on the international agenda prioritized in terms of an approach that you're seeing work that will move the needle on AI governance and particularly trustworthy and safe AI? Chris, I want to start with you.
Yeah, well, I would just pick up with on Juha's point about trust and say that one of the things that really needs to happen globally is a norm that's developed where firms that are developing frontier AI models, like genuinely kind of the newest, most powerful models, that they publish a risk management framework about how they're going to handle the most extreme risks associated with their technology. And then that they also publish, this is a point that was also made, that they publish kind of systematic updates on how they're implementing it so that the public can be aware of the activity that they're doing and can kind of judge for themselves exactly how trustworthy these products are.
Great call to action. Brian, over to you.
I think a concrete step I would like to see is an international effort to define what we view as red lines or unacceptable outcomes from advanced AI systems. And based on those red lines, we can also better define a set of risk threshold and early warning indicators, as Professor Zhang Ya-Qin has mentioned. And what is acceptable and what is safe should not be left to the AI industry alone. And as hopefully we have learned from past financial crises and environmental disasters, some of the unchecked risk-taking by a few elites could actually lead to systemic risk on a global level, including for the global south and unprotected communities worldwide. So I think this is an area where the international community and civil society have to come together and have a strong and decisive voice.
I love that call to action of coming together. Juha, what would you like to see over the next 12 months?
Well, 12 months is a long time in AI, but it can also be quite a short time for some things. And I'm thinking of one thing in particular, which is the fact that we've had kind of a proliferation of initiatives, which also means that there's been a proliferation of monitoring, reporting, etc. Requirements, and this can put burden on developers. And I think that maybe some streamlining of initiatives would be quite useful. For that, however, 12 months is quite a short time. So it really depends on what you look at, whether that's a long or a short time perspective.
Great call to action on streamlining. Ya-Qin.
For the last 3 months, last 3 years, I've been a strong advocate for registration, identification of AI-generated contents, models, and particular agents. I'm glad to see some of this is happening in China, and I hope that can scale to the rest of the world. It's ID.
Udbhav, over to you.
For me, I'd say it would definitely be developer agency, very similar to the recall example that I mentioned earlier. I think it's vital that application providers be able to make decisions for their users in order to protect them from risks that AI systems could pose. Privacy is one of them. It's okay for a user to be able to override those protections, but right now I think there's been a pretty symbiotic relationship between operating system providers and applications that run on them. I think we're going to see that radically change with the deployment of AI systems, and in order to make sure that if something is sensitive, the user doesn't necessarily need to be able to menu dive deep into settings in order to be able to protect their settings, but an application should be able to protect the privacy of the user on their behalf, like we did with recall, should become much more of a norm, because without that, we're not going to have 7 billion people being able to protect themselves to the level that they deserve.
One of the key takeaways that I take from this conversation and the great insights of all 5 of you is really this need to invest not only in cooperation and research as AI advances in terms of what's possible with regards to safety, but also making sure that that cooperation is across regions and jurisdictions and across stakeholder groups where transparency and responsibility is prioritized. Particularly, and many of you have underlined this, as we become very, very aware in the importance of centralizing responsibility, because at the same time, responsibility drives the trust that's missing, which will drive adoption, which will ultimately drive innovation and beneficial use for all. This has been the most enjoyable AI governance speed dating ever with the 5 of you. Thank you very much for your insights and for sharing your learnings about what's working and what's not. Chris, Juha, Udbhav, Ya-Qin, and Brian. I hope, as many of you underlined the importance of conversations and asking the right questions, that this is the beginning of a conversation and not the end going forward, and hope that all of you can interact with some of the audience in the room about how to take those call to actions forward with the great group at AI for Good. Thank you very much all, and have a great rest of your morning.